The Islamic Foundation presents Lessons from the Life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Part 4.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى صحابته ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا ورفيقا مما يقربنا إليك. اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا وقلبا خاشعا ولسانا ذاكرا وشفاء من كل داء يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. Alhamdulillah. So today, inshallah, I wanted to spend a few minutes kind of continuing with building off a topic we introduced last week. Last week, we talked about some of the lessons from the Hijrah that the Muslims understood. And what I wanted to talk about is, as I mentioned last week, that the city of Medina was previously known as Yathrib. It was literally a place where people became ill or sick. And when the Prophet ﷺ went there, the city became known as Madinatun Nabi, or the city of the Prophet ﷺ, of course, also known as Al-Madinatul Munawwara, the illuminated city. And so the question that we can just kind of ask is, what was the significance in, number one, the name change, and also number two, why was it called as such, and number three, what were the implications of this change? So something that we may not have really given a lot of thought to. We just kind of assume that this has been the name of Medina, but the name itself is very significant, and that's what we'll spend a little bit of time talking about today, inshallah. So number one, why was it called Medina? There's other words that can be used for city or village or town, and Medina certainly didn't really meet the qualifications of a city on the scale of Mecca and Taif. These were the two large cities, and in fact, one of the problems that the Quraysh had was this, and the Quran even quotes this argument that لولا نزل هذا القرآن على رجل من القريتين عظيم, that why was this Quran not sent down to a man from one of the two great cities that they thought, which was Mecca and Taif. Taif was a very wealthy town. It was a summer resort location for many of the Quraysh that they would go because the climate was much cooler there, and those of you who may have gone to Taif know that it's a very scenic and a very beautifully located city. And so this was their claim. So the Hijazi Arabs always thought that Mecca and Taif were the two main cities. And so on one hand, to now basically name a small village, which was what Medina was, it was just an oasis type of a place, to now call it as the city was a very significant political move, because now it's like saying that, well, not just Mecca and Taif are important for the Muslims. Because of the Prophet ﷺ, this town, which was known as Yathrib, a place where people became sick, is now on the scale of being a city. So that itself, calling it a city, is now putting it on par as saying that Medina is no longer down here. If Mecca and Taif for the Arabs was up here, now Medina is up here, not because they have wealthy people there or because they have the Kaaba there, but because of the Prophet ﷺ being there. So this was a very symbolic and a very strategic move that was made, and it was also sort of thumbing the nose at the Quraysh, as if to say that you had this brilliant, this noble human being who was arguably the greatest asset that you have, and now he has left your city and come to our city, and because of that, because now we have your most precious product, so to speak, your most precious resource, we are now going to call ourselves as Madinatun Nabi. So there was a lot of, you have to sort of appreciate some of the sarcasm and the humor that is going on there. This certainly irritated the Quraysh to no extent, that these people from Yathrib, who they viewed as sort of uneducated, uncultured people. How dare they now declare themselves as a city, but also declare themselves as a city because of our most valuable asset, because they still viewed him as one of their great, the children or the great products of the city. And they knew that even if you stripped away Islam and Nubuwah, just on just the sheer character and the nobility of people from that city, that we are now a city because of this great man who has come to bless us with his presence. So that was a very symbolic and a very political move that was made. The other reason it was called Medina is we can see in the word Medina, the word deen is there. That whereas in Mecca, the commandments and the revelations would primarily be built upon Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah. These are the three themes about the oneness of Allah, the truthfulness and the legitimacy of the Prophet ﷺ as a messenger, and then, of course, the reminders to the people of Mecca. Primarily, that was the main khitab, the main audience, was about the reality of the hereafter. Medina was now going to be the place where the deen, in terms of the communal, political, and all of these other out beyond just spiritual and the ibadat, the acts of worship, that the deen would truly be established. In other words, that Islam was no longer just about the 5 pillars, but it was also about a complete way of life. And that's why deen, as we say, that Islam is not a religion, but it's a way of life. That this is a place where now even the mundane and the everyday matters could also be established. And of course, the model would be the Prophet ﷺ, that this is how you are supposed to live in a society. So by and large, messengers ﷺ were always sent to society. They didn't live in the forest or live isolated. And in Mecca, it was no longer possible for them to have essentially their communal and other obligations that needed to be done established, other than the ibadat, which were done primarily secretly. But even things which we'll see that become ordained in Medina, such as zakat and the hajj, these require basically a state or a community in order to be able to fulfill these obligations. So the Medina would now be the place where the deen would be established. We see even in the word Medina, you can see the word deen is there, as if to say that this is where the deen would be really practiced. The other thing would be that this was where now the deen and the dunya would be mixed together. So the word deen, it's related to many words such as dain, it's related to danu, it's related to other words, but it's also related to the word dunya. You can see the same letters that make up the word deen also make up the word dunya, as if to say that the deen is the place, or the deen encompasses the way to sort of live in the dunya. So the Medina would now allow for the Muslims to not only practice their deen, but also to practice their dunya. So it wasn't just, like we said, about worshiping Allah, but also it was about how do you live in society, how do you earn a daily living, how do you interact with people, and how do you basically live in society. This was where the dunya would also become part of the deen. And so the Medina was necessary to basically now combine the deen and the dunya into a complete way of life, where the deen would incorporate every single aspect of life. So Mecca was necessary for the Muslims to build this foundation of Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah, to build up their akhlaq and all of these things, but it now had to be taken to the next level. So we can see how that community building doesn't just happen overnight by establishing a state or having some type of a political revolution, but spiritual revolutions, ethical and moral reform, and particularly for the Muslims, the ibadat reform, have to precede nation building. And that's why we see in modern times now every single effort to sort of have a quote-unquote Muslim society that doesn't actually have a system of tarbiyah and ethical and akhlaqi reform, character reform, has always failed, right? So you can't kind of put the cart before the horse. Allah Ta'ala didn't tell the Prophet ﷺ to establish a state from day one, because there had to be this spiritual revolution that would take place. The other thing that's very fascinating is Medina is also related to the word Dayana, right? So Dayana, you can see the same trilateral root of Dal, Ya, and Nun is there. Dayana is known as buying and selling, right? It's another word for basically engaging in business transactions. So one of the key differences of Medina as compared to Mecca is that now there was going to be an impetus or motivation for the Muslims to be involved in the marketplace, right? So commerce was established. So yes, we say the very first thing the Prophet ﷺ did was to build the masjid in Medina. But the second thing, which is also important and is probably the most important thing for the dunya, where the deen was now going to take place, was that the Muslims now took control of the marketplace. The Prophet ﷺ wanted the Muslims to have a strong presence in financial and commercial transactions, and this made sense on multiple levels. The Muhajirin, which were primarily the Quraysh, they were merchants and traders to begin with, so this was their way of life. The Ansar, the Aus and the Khazraj, were primarily farmers. Some of them did trade, but they were primarily farmers. So now the Muhajirin, who had come from Mecca, that's what they knew. So the Prophet ﷺ, number one, wanted to establish a sense of familiar business that they could be involved in. And number two, he wanted Muslims now to have economic independence, economic power, because ultimately it is the market that drives this society, right? So we hear even now with these times where the calls to reopen the economy, because politics and all that stuff aside, we can see that the reason why people are so wanting to talk about this, because everyone knows that unless the economy of any society is strong, then the stability of that society, the power of that government, is tied to the strength of the economy, right? So here the Prophet ﷺ is telling the Muslims that, look, you don't have to apologize for wanting to be involved in business transactions, but what the deen will do is the deen will tell you how to do it properly, so that not only will you make a profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, that's the beauty of our Prophet, is that our Prophet shows us how to make a profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, both in the dunya and in the hereafter, right? So that's just a little wordplay for those of you who can follow along with that joke. But also how to be successful in those business transactions so that we can be successful in the hereafter. So this is why the word suq is related to saq, right? So saq is like the shin or the lower leg. So just as like the lower leg drives the human body and allows us to move forward, the suq is what allows society to drive and to move forward. So unless the suq is sound, it is ethical, it has ethical and moral principles that guide it, and that those who are involved in the suq can earn a benefit, and not just a living, but a higher standard of living, then the society will not be successful. So that was the brilliance of the Prophet ﷺ, was that in Mecca it was all about Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah. Here it was like, well, now we have to still do the Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah as well, but brother, you have to also earn your daily bread as well, and it has to be done in a halal way. And not only does it have to be, will it be done in a halal way, now the prophetic model and under prophetic leadership, that it will be done in such a way that will be done in a very enriched and a very a way that will be very profitable. And that is why, as we mentioned last week, that some of the Meccans, such as Abdurrahman ibn Auf, Uthman ibn Affan, radiallahu anhum, those they had left behind a lot of their wealth in Mecca, but as soon as they entered the marketplace, these were skilled businessmen. They didn't have to take out any loans or cheat and lie to people. They were just very, very smart. They just had business savvy, right? And they didn't have to do an MBA at any famous school or anything like that, but they were so skilled that just started off with very little, and in a very short time, they're able to recuperate their finances and establish economic dominion and superiority once again, like they were able to do so. So this is sort of now the model that the Muslims were being taught, that the Medina is the place where dayana, where buying and selling would be done, and it would have to be done according to the deen. And if you do so, that you will be successful, you will earn a profit, and you will have economic security and things like that as well. So this is why it comes perhaps as no surprise that if we look at the longest ayah in the Quran, it's not an ayah that has to do with hell and heaven. It's not an ayah that has to do with all of the beautiful names of Allah. But the longest ayah in the Quran, which comes at the end of Surah Al-Baqarah, towards the end of Surah Al-Baqarah, is what is known as Ayatul Dain, right? The ayah of business transactions and how if you enter into a business contract, what are all the rules in terms of having witnesses, making sure that the contract is written out, what to do if someone cannot produce witnesses, etc., etc. The point, though, in this ayah is that the longest ayah in the Quran is essentially a legal text, right? It's a legal do's and don'ts that, on one hand, seem to be very boring, right? It's not like very majestic about these are the qualities of Allah, this is how Jannah will be, this is what you should fear about the hellfire. It's about some very mundane, nitty-gritty, kind of very boring type of stuff. But the end of the ayah is very interesting, right? The end of the ayah says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. That have taqwa of Allah. Now, why does this come at the end of the ayah? It is as if to say that if it is to tell the Muslims, and they understood this, of course, but it's to tell us that if you truly understood the lessons of Makkah, which is to have taqwa of Allah, this awareness of Allah, fear of Allah, and recognition that He is watching, etc., etc., then it's easy to do that in the masjid. It's easy to do that with fasting and things like that. But can you do that with your business transactions? Can you be sound and ethical and just and not cheat people and take advantage of people and exploit people? That's where taqwa of Allah is really needed. Right? Wattaqullah in this. Right? So it's easy to wattaqullah fi salah, fi sawm. It's not a problem. But wattaqullah fi dayana, in buying and selling, that's a little bit more difficult. That's a little bit more challenging, and but perhaps that's the true litmus test for whether a person has taqwa or not. And then Allah says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهِ. If you do this, then Allah will teach you even more. He will give you even more knowledge and even more barakah and more khair. Why? وَاللَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. Because Allah is knowledgeable over all things. So for the Muslims, they understood that if they properly behaved with taqwa, with ethics, with morality in their buying and selling, this would prove to them that they had understood the deen in the Medina. And if they did this, they knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually give them much more than they could have expected, much more than that they could have wanted. And that is why, if you look at many of the books of fiqh, particularly in the Hanafi school, that these are the longest books, right? Kitab al-Buyu' if you look at the famous Hanafi text of Hidayah, is a very long text. The other books of Salah and Sawm and Zakah, they're relatively short compared to Kitab al-Buyu'. Why? Because all of that ibadat, it's pretty easy to have taqwa in that, but how do you maintain taqwa in buying and selling and making sure that you're not exploiting people, that you're not being unjust, you're not committing dhulm to people? That is why all these rules are necessary. A man came to Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, rahimahullah, who was one of the famous students of Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, and he said to him that, why is it that you scholars, all you do is you write books about buying and selling? Why don't you write a book about zuhud, about asceticism and spirituality and purification of the soul and all these other topics? And Imam Muhammad said, you fool, if you haven't realized that all of these books that we've written of Kitab al-Buyu' and buying and selling and how to be fair and just and follow the Islamic law and business transactions, this is zuhd. this is true spirituality, right? So yes, you can sit there and make dhikr and recite Allah's names as many times as you want and pray in tahajjud and all of that. That's good, and we should do it. This is not to say that we shouldn't do it. But the true test to see whether we have internalized any of those lessons is how do you behave in the marketplace? How do you behave in the dunya? How do you behave in your day job? This is now what is being told to the Muslims, is that the Medina will test how well you have understood this deen that you claim to follow from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So unless you do this, then you can't say that you're following this deen. So this deen is not just salah, zakah, saum, these types of things, but it is also how you live in society, how you treat people, how you earn your daily living. And if you do that properly, then you've passed the test of practicing the deen. And on top of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. Allah will give you even more, and He is knowledgeable over all things. So this is what was now being told to the Muslims, that if you want to have a healthy society, these are the things that you have to understand. And the last thing was that in a Medina, when you have a healthy and thriving marketplace, this is what is necessary in order to control society, to flourish. In other words, Medina was not just a place where Islam was meant to just live, but it was meant to flourish. And the only way that it was going to flourish is if you had economical and financial independence and stability. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ would now show them that there is nothing so quote unquote irreligious, right, about not wanting to be part of the dunya and not wanting to engage in society, that the true method of being quote unquote religious was to be part of society and not to let that society consume you, but rather to use that as a means of drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of these most crushing and oppressive things that can happen when you're in a society is the concept of debt, right? So that's why dain, which means debt, is something that the Prophet ﷺ would make dua for habitually. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ghalabati ad-daini wa qahri ar-rijal. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from the overpoweringness of debt and the overpoweringness of people taking advantage of me. Because, in other words, if I fall into debt, then other men will have power over me, right? So this is what we see in the world today, that people are often held down by being put into debt and being put into loans, and that is how institutions and other people are able to control them. This happens even with individuals, to societies, even to entire countries to this day that are basically held in debt to the IMF and the World Bank and things like that. So here the Prophet ﷺ is telling the Muslims that you have to control the marketplace, you have to have economic stability, and it is from the Sunnah, therefore, to have business acumen, right? We know the Prophet ﷺ was a businessman, and he was extremely skilled, he was extremely successful, but he never had to cheat anyone. And in fact, it was his kind of refreshing honesty and ethics that made him stand out. So this is extremely important for Muslims, that we should be involved in business. It is from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to be involved in business. But those of us who want to be involved in business, there's a higher calling and a higher morality that you are going to be held to compared to really any other profession. That is why there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ saying that the honest businessman, the honest merchant, that he will be with the martyrs on the Day of Judgment as a reward, because it's difficult. Right? It's difficult to be ethically and morally balanced in business, but this is what the Medina offers, is that the Medina offers a place for the Muslims to be able to do that. And so there are lessons that we, as Muslims living in modern times, can appreciate, that the name change from Yathrib to Medina teaches us, as well as how the Muslims understood that this is a place where the deen permeated and included every single facet of society, particularly how they would buy and sell, and also to stay out of debt, realizing the overpoweringness of debt. And if you controlled the marketplace, you would control society, and this is what allow the deen to actually flourish. So these are all of the various lessons that we can sort of take from this name change now of Yathrib to Medina, and some of the things that would happen. And indeed, we see that, for example, many of the Medinian revelations, such as Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Nisa, these have a lot of rules and regulations about how to live in society. There's no doubt ayat in there about Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah, but we can see that there's going to be now a shift in many of the Medinian revelations towards everyday matters and how to live in society, how to earn a living, and the rules that are necessary for a well-regulated, healthy, and successful society. And the brilliance of the Prophet ﷺ is that he was able to create this, which is very unique among all of the Anbiya alayhim salam. Certainly there were prophets like Dawood and Sulaiman alayhim salam who did that, but it was more on sort of a kingdom level. Particularly Sulaiman alayhi salam was born into that. Dawood alayhi salam basically inherited that. But the Prophet ﷺ is very unique in the sense of being a refugee and now establishing a city almost from the ground up that would now become the dominant power over a period of about 10 years. This we don't see in the life of any other Prophet ﷺ, at least that we know of, to this level. So, there are other prophets had some power. Yusuf ﷺ certainly had some power, etc., but none to the level of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is also sort of a final lesson for us, is that there's no other city that we know of in the world that is basically given this maqam, this position of Medinatun Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, because number one, no other city is named after any other prophet to this level. I mean, obviously Bethlehem and other cities are associated with prophets, but to be named after a prophet is really not seen on such a large scale. That's number one. And number two, there's no other city that would be named after our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So for the people of Medina, they understood and they appreciated sort of this name change, that they would no longer be known as this place where people became sick, but they would be now known as the city of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that is why we appreciate and love that city so much. And so these are some of the lessons that we can think about just with the name change that I could think about for today's lesson. We ask and pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the ability, the tawfiq, to internalize and understand these lessons and to appreciate some of these lessons, and most importantly, that He allows us to live our deen in our society in a way and in a manner that is pleasing to Him, particularly in the way that we acquire our wealth in our daily living. وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله ولكم وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين جزاكم الله خيرا السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.